Okay. Go ahead.
Go ahead. you got you know there's got to you know there's got to be a David Frost side to this thing. You got to ask. You got to ask
Okay, Ross.
questions. You got to ask me questions.
All right, Ross. With since a lot of your songs are topical.
All right, let's do this official. This is Ross Altman, and I'm here in the baseball park of the Adams Avenue Unplugged Festival in San Diego on April 27th, 2014, being interviewed by documentary filmmaker and videographer and recording engineer Richard Pollard, who has put quite a number of my songs up on YouTube over the years and has documented musicians all across San Diego and musicians from all over the country who come through San Diego. And so it's a real honor every year just to be able to reconnect with Richard and now his beautiful wife, Krista. So I will do my best to say something reasonably intelligent. If you want to give me some leads here on what we can talk about.
Okay, Ross. Frequently you write topical songs. I remember one in the past about Martha Stewart, and I know you've written a lot of songs about things that have gone on that have happened, and things that you felt shouldn't have happened, and things that were ludicrous and otherwise nearly insane, including your Guess Who's Coming to the White House, which was long before a lot of people realized that that Barack Obama would be elected president and serve 2 terms. How do you come up with the ideas for your songs, and how do you put them together? Lyrics and music all at one time, lyrics first, and in general, how you put together a song when you write one.
It can happen almost any way that a song can be written. I've probably done at one time or another. And I didn't really prepare as well as I should have, you know, kind of to have answers. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about this, but let me give you a little overview of what I know about it. Pete Seeger has often added music to pre-existing lyrics. He's done that with songs by Malvina Reynolds. He did that with the lyrics that Lee Hayes started giving to him at a business meeting of People's Songs that turned out to be If I Had a Hammer. And he did it with Turn, Turn, Turn. He added a wonderful melody to, and then arranged and adapted the verses from Ecclesiastes. So for Turn, Turn, Turn. So he's often worked from lyrics to music and set a pre-existing text to music. Then there's Phil Oakes, who's my favorite example of working the other way. And that was when he was sitting in his bedroom. He was staying at his sister Sunny Oakes' house in Far Rockaway, New York. And she came home one day and heard him playing guitar in the bedroom, and he was doing this. I'll tell you what, let me get these strings are pretty dense to play without any picks. he was playing just a guitar riff, basically, and it was repeated over and over and over. And finally she came in, she said, "Phil, what are you doing?" He said, "I've just written my greatest song." She said, "Really?" She said, "What's it called?" He says, "I don't know. I haven't written any lyrics yet." And that to me is a real object lesson in the kinds of approaches that a lot of topical songwriters take, which is to start with a topic, then develop it into lyrics, and finally, almost as an afterthought, to find some way to sing the damn thing once you've gotten it written. And because of that, you have an enormous number of not very memorable topical songs, because the music has been kind of an afterthought. And what makes Phil Ochs' music stand out to me is the fact that he didn't look at songwriting in that way. He realized he had something special before he knew what it was, before he knew what the song was about, because the music was central to what he did. And if you listen to his songs, you will hear that over and over again. They're not just wonderful statements about the world or about politics or about the Vietnam War or whatever they may be. They're beautiful melodies, completely apart from what they have to say. And that's the song that turned into The Power and the Glory. Come on and take a walk with me through this green and growing land. Walk through the meadows and the mountains and the sand. Walk through the mountains and the rivers and the plains. Walk through the sun and walk through the rain. Here's a land full of power and glory, beauty that words cannot recall. Oh, her power shall rest on the strings of her freedom. Glory shall rest on a song, on a song. I don't want to have to do the whole song for illustrations of this sort, but that's a good example of working from music to lyrics. And Pete is a wonderful example of working the other way. So it sometimes can depend on the song, and the same songwriter may do it one way at one time and another way at another time. What I have found in my case is that almost never do I have an idea that I've got to cover a subject. I've got to have a song about this, that, or the other thing, because that's exactly how you can get into that trap. And I've always kind of followed a principle that I learned from the English poet W.H. Auden. Auden said, when he was asked, how do you know if a young person has talent, or is, if a young poet is going to develop into something really good? And Auden said, you can always pretty much tell by this. He said, if somebody thinks they've got something important to say to the world, he said, you can almost guarantee that it's going to burn out very quickly. But if somebody just likes hanging around the language and seeing what the language may have to say, that indicates that they have the attitude that he associated with being a poet. That you first have to love the language, and secondarily, you connect it to the world outside. And I have found that over and over and over again, where a rhyme will occur to me that is surprising, and this is where I wish I had, prepared, because I know that I've often started songs just by some fortuitous connection of one word with another, and that is like rubbing two sticks together, and then something happens as a result. That's one way. And then another way of getting into a song is being surprised by an association that you didn't expect. I'll give you an example. This is the 25th anniversary coming up on June 4th of the student demonstrations in Tiananmen Square in China, where Chinese students stood up, not just to the local police and not just to the local mayor, but to tanks that rolled in to Beijing to crush their movement for democracy. And there's a great picture of one Chinese protester standing in front of a phalanx of tanks by the so-called People's Liberation Army, refusing to be cowed, refusing to be intimidated, and refusing to leave, and saying, "Roll over me." The demonstrations lasted all spring and are now thought of as Beijing Spring. And I was watching that, like everybody else, on TV for weeks. And I suppose the thought crossed my mind, gee, I'm a songwriter. Isn't there some way you can, get a song out of this? But I couldn't find anything to get into a real song, and not just, a newspaper editorial set to music, which is what Phil Oakes described a lot of topical songs as being. He says, those aren't really songs, they're newspaper editorials, even if they have a tune. And then one day I opened up a newspaper in the LA Weekly, and I saw a photograph. And it wasn't the photograph you would think would have inspired a song of this Chinese protester in front of the tanks. That's what you'd assume. You see that, and my God, how can you not be moved to write something? That's not what did it for me. What I saw was a photograph of a Chinese protester holding up a sign. And the sign said, "We shall overcome." That hit me between the eyes. Because I had been singing that song in the civil rights movement since 1962, probably. And I never expected to see it halfway around the world, in Beijing, China, having inspired an entirely different culture that most of whom probably did not speak English, and yet that song had traveled across borders and across all kinds of boundaries to get there. And when I saw that, I started working on the song. And then at the very end, in the last verse, I was able to pull in the great photograph of the protester in front of the tanks. But had it not been for just the LA Weekly publishing one picture of a Chinese protester holding up a sign that said, "We shall overcome," I would not have written this song. And this one I'll sing a little bit more. It's just called Tiananmen Square. Did you hear the Chinese students singing "We Shall Overcome" sounded sweet as it did then at the March on Washington. They quoted Gandhi and Dr. King. There was freedom in the air. They gave flowers to the soldiers in Tiananmen Square. Did you see the goddess of democracy standing in front of Mao, and the students' smiling faces as they chanted freedom now? Did you see this morning's headlines? Martial law declared as the tanks were slowly rolling towards Tiananmen Square. My brothers and my sisters, don't give in to despair. Seeds you plant today may bloom in a field you know not where. Who'd have thought all those years ago, when we marched for freedom here, they'd be singing "We Shall Overcome" in Tiananmen Square. Did you see the goddess of democracy trampled to the ground, and the People's Liberation Army shoot the people down? It made me think of Kent State and the students who died there. It's a long way from Ohio to Tiananmen Square. My brothers and my sisters, don't give in to despair. Seeds you plant today may bloom in a field you know not where. Who'd have thought all those years ago, when we marched for freedom here, they'd be singing "We Shall Overcome" in Tiananmen Square. They can clean the streets and wash the blood from the bullet-ridden wall, but alone against their sea of tanks, one unarmed man stood tall. And they can't erase that photograph, no matter how they dare. Say nothing's ever happened in Tiananmen Square. My brothers and my sisters, don't give in to despair. Seeds you plant today may bloom in a field you know not where. Who'd have thought all those years ago, when we marched for freedom here, they'd be singing "We Shall Overcome" in Tiananmen Square. Another thing about that song that I owe to my mentors is that there are a lot of questions that I ask in the song. Instead of making statements, did you see the goddess of democracy? Not, I saw the goddess of democracy standing in front of Mao. Did you see this morning's headlines? Not, I saw this morning's headlines, or look at this morning's headlines, martial law declared. Did you see the goddess of democracy trampled to the ground, etc.? I don't start making statements per se until the last verse, and a part of the influence in that way of telling the story, which is basically what the song does, comes from Bob Dylan and Pete Seeger. Dylan's questions in Blowing in the Wind, how many roads must a man walk down? And Pete Seeger, where have all the flowers gone? And they show you as Pete has said a number of times, that often a question is a more powerful way of saying something than to say it directly. So I've always kind of kept that, thought in the back of my mind as well. But sometimes, the poet Richard Wilbur, who's a great American contemporary poet, now quite elderly in his 80s, who taught at Wesleyan many years, wrote a wonderful essay about poets' connected influence to each other and to the tradition. It's called A Conversation of Poets. And he talks about examples where a poem today has got some sense of being connected to poems from hundreds of years before, and how the tradition kind of builds on itself. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. The oldest English poem in many poetry anthologies that students get acquainted with literature through is Western Wind. It's only 4 lines, it's a fragment. And it goes, "Western wind, when wilt thou blow? The small rains down shall rain. Christ, that my love were in my arms, and I in my bed again." That's all there is to it. It's a Middle English poem. Those brief images have been picked up by poets in the 20th century. Here's one. "Christ that my love were in my arms and I in my bed again." Bob Dylan song, 1963. If today was not an endless highway, if tonight was not a crooked trail, if tomorrow wasn't such a long time, lonesome would mean nothing to me at all. Yes, and only if my own true love was waiting, and if I could hear her heart softly pound. Only she was lying by me, and I lie in my bed once again. He took that last line from Western Wind and incorporated it into a modern love song. Yeats took another part of that same image. It says, "The small rains down, Christ that my love were in my arms and I in my bed again." It was a song called "Politics" that he wrote, I think, in 1916. And he said, "How can I, that girl standing there, my attention fix on Roman or on Russian or on Spanish politics? Yet there is a learned man who knows what he's talking about. And maybe what they say is true of war and war's alarms, but oh, that I were young again and held her in my arms." He pulls that line from Western Wind, from the oldest poem he knows, and turns it into a, line about a very different kind of poem. And then there's one other, a cowboy song that has been a part of my repertoire for as long as I can remember, Colorado Trail. And just like Western Wind, it's a fragment. It's only 4 lines. Eyes like the morning star, cheeks like the rose. Laura was a pretty girl, God Almighty knows. Weep all ye little rains, wail, winds wail. All along the Colorado Trail. Weep all ye little rains connects back to Western Wind, where it says, Western wind, when wilt thou blow? The small rains down shall rain. And the cowboy song says, weep all ye little rains. Christ that I were in my arms, Christ that my lover and I am my divinity. So a cowboy found an image from this poem 200 years before he came along on his horse and managed to work it into a song. So those are examples of how the really good songs are written not just because you have something important you want to say, but because you know the tradition and you're able to draw from the tradition and pull a line, a thought, an image from something that may be hundreds of years older than you are, and find a way to connect with it. Those are examples of both poetry and song that show that the worst thing you can do is to try to reinvent the wheel as a songwriter. The reason Dylan is still important and has been writing great songs is because he knew 1,000 songs before he even thought to write a song. And when he wrote "Blowing in the Wind," that's another great example of a real act of genius in songwriting. When he wrote "Blowing in the Wind," it was 1962. And everybody was marching against the bomb, against nuclear testing. And I have a whole book of songs for peace, with all the wonderful topical songs from that period about the bomb. And most of them, even though they were popular and connected with people at the time, are basically only remembered because they're in the book. So if you open it up, and occasionally you may find some reason to sing one of those songs. Ban the bloody H-bomb. Ewan McCall wrote that. Things of that sort. They were all over the place. Bob Dylan goes into the New York Public Library, and while everybody else is reading the New York Times, he's reading books on the Civil War and seeing how people thought of war, not from 1962, but from 1862. And so he writes this song. First of all, he takes a tune that was from the abolitionist movement. The abolitionist movement of the 1850s and 1860s. No more auction block over me. No more, no more. No more auction block over me. Many thousands done. And Dylan takes that melody and does this with it. How many roads must a man walk down before you call him a man? How many seas must the white dove sail before she sleeps in the sand? How many times? And here is one of the great examples of Bob Dylan's genius. You never hear about the atom bomb. How many times must the cannonballs fly before they're forever banned? He takes the word banned from the world around him, but he associates it and links it not to the atom bomb, not to banning the bomb, but to the cannonballs that were used in the Civil War. In that song, you don't see any images from the 1960s. Nobody's driving a car down the road. How many roads must a man walk down before you call him a man? How many seas must the white dove sail? The dove of peace, Noah's dove. And then the cannonball from 100 years before. The song is built on images that are either timeless or timely 100 years before. And yet, the amazing thing is, when people heard that song for the first time, they reacted as if the song was written for them now, 1962, 1963. It became a hit song when the Peter Palmieri did it. That is, says something about the art of writing songs, how mysterious it can be, and how it takes an artist able to see the world in terms of how other people have seen it and other people's experiences have interpreted it, and then make a new arrangement. Pascal, the great French critic, was asked about one of his works. He says, well, what's new? He said, this kind of thing has been said before. And Pascal said, the arrangement is new. The arrangement is new. Oftentimes, that's what it how about calling it an afternoon? You've got other things to document, and maybe one of these days we'll sit down again. But that gives you some idea of the kind of thought processes that often get filtered into a song or lyrics or something. They can come from a lot of different associations, and can still say something meaningful to people today, even with a line or an image or a phrase that you remembered from your childhood. What? Uh-huh.
Whatever thoughts come out that we are hopeful that from the mind because I've been in theater And yet they still retain some contemporary ideas and thoughts. Talk a little thought about those thoughts that are never lost.
Woody Guthrie did the same thing. I'll end with this. Woody Guthrie was, when he was invited to Washington and Oregon in 1940 to write songs for the Bonneville Power Dam Administration, to essentially help with the World War II propaganda effort. They wanted him to write songs about the building of the Bonneville Power Dam and the Columbia River Dam. And he wound up being hired by the Department of the Interior for 28 days on salary to write songs, to walk around the federal building projects and hopefully get inspired to write something. So what does Woody do? They took him out, they paid him, I don't know what he was paid. It wasn't much, but it was one of the only times he was actually on a salary as a songwriter. So they took him out to the Columbia River and the Bonneville Dam project, and they told him he could talk to anybody he wanted, and go and walk around and soak up the atmosphere and so forth. What does Woody do? He thanks them very much, and he finds the nearest library. And he spent a couple of weeks buried in the stacks of the Oregon Public Library, learning as much as he could about the history of that part of the country, the Pacific Northwest. Let me see. The green Douglas firs where the water cuts through. Down her wild canyons to the mountain she flew. The Pacific Northwest to the ocean so blue. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Your power is turning our darkness to dawn. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Well, other great rivers add power to you. The Yakima Snake and the Klickitat, the Sandy Willamette and the Hood River too. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Your power is turning our darkness to dawn. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Down at the docks there are ships in the locks. The waters have risen and cleared all the rocks. Shiploads of plenty will steam past the docks. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Your power is turning our darkness to dawn. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Now, the same principle that Dylan used, adapting No More Auction Block, Woody took Leadbelly's song, Goodnight Irene, which was in his repertoire for years, and took the tune and then wrote a brand new set of lyrics to it. So instead of Irene, good night, Irene, good night, good night, Irene, good night, Irene, I'll see you in my dreams. Roll So, but the funny thing is, from the standpoint of the point I'm trying to make here, Rounder Records found there was a guy working for the federal government in the same Power Administration building where Woody had been recording his songs. He wrote 28 songs in 28 days. He was on salary, and he worked just like any working person would work. He took it very seriously. That's where he wrote Pastures of Plenty. He wrote, I'm blanking on it. But the point is, when Rounder Records got a hold of the acetates, they released a record of Woody Guthrie's Columbia River Songs. That was the title of the album. The cover of the album is a perfect object lesson in the difference between our romantic fantasies of how poets work and the reality. Because the picture is of Woody Guthrie standing in the open air against a beautiful Pacific Northwest landscape where you see mountains behind him and you see rivers flowing in front of him, and you see him standing there with the guitar like he's making up songs by the inspiration he's getting from the natural beauty of the world that he's writing about. Whereas in fact, he's buried in a dark, dingy library, squinting to read up on everything he can get his hands on about the history of the place and about the names of the rivers and the names of the mountains and so forth, so he can put as much real detail, real specific detail in these songs. If they had put that picture on the cover, most likely people would have just looked and they would have said, well, that's not terribly interesting. So they put this beautiful picture of a painting of Woody in a natural splendor with these Columbia River songs, because that's our picture. That's how we romanticize how poets work. It's really much closer to the way I've described in both Woody and then Dylan 20 years later, working on Blowing in the Wind in the New York Public Library. And since, I'm an academic, I have a background, used to teach English and speech, and that's where all my academic training is, and all my first kind of immersion in literature, both poetry and music. And so when I hear stories like that, it's inspiring. It's tremendously inspiring that these institutions that are given often short shrift in Los Angeles. I don't know how it is in San Diego. In Los Angeles, if they have a budget crunch, the very first thing they cut from is the library, the public library. That's the first thing they cut.
Don't get it started.
Libraries, instead of being open 7 days a week or 6 days a week or 5 days a week, often 3 days a week. And instead of 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day, often 5 hours, 4 hours a day. Because that's what they figured is the least important public investment, the libraries. But in the 1930s, during the WPA, do you know that in the worst economic depression this country has ever faced, not one library was ever closed. Not one library was ever closed. Somehow they had a sense of what was important that we've lost in our headlong rush to the information superhighway. We don't have the values that got us through the Great Depression. They didn't look around and say, well, the first thing we can save money is by shuttering the libraries. Those libraries were started by Benjamin Franklin. Those were the first public institutions we had, were public libraries, and they were started by Benjamin Franklin. And somehow in the 1930s, they felt the value, the connection. And in the 1990s and 2000 and 21st century, you have to fight tooth and nail for things that people took for granted. And so when I hear stories about how Woody Guthrie, composed his songs and how Bob Dylan composed his songs, to me, it's the most inspiring message of all. That you can find out what's really important in the public sphere, and how you can never just take it for granted, you know. Okay, Richard, thank you very much, and Crystal, thank you so much, and anybody who sees this, thank you for listening and watching.
And Ross, thank you so much for taking the time, and safe travels. And we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.